Hello. Can you tell that I got caught slightly by surprise there? Ran out of time prepping just as everything goes live. Hopefully, that is not a harbinger of things to come. This is going to be the first in a brand new series. I was actually scrambling. Hey, Tucker Todd, Team Todd represent indeed. I was actually scrambling for ideas of what to do today. And Krister, who is a friend of the channel, was had asked me, "Hey, are you planning on streaming in about 45 minutes?" And I said, "Well, that's the plan. Don't know what to talk about." And they sent over a question basically about dungeoneering, which got me thinking about, well, I've got this or dungeon crawling, I should say, which made me think, well, I've got a hex crawling series. It might be nice to change gears and do something else and make that a new series. So I thought, well, why not just start a dungeon crawling series? We go from there. And I think one of the obvious things to talk about with dungeon crawling, and there'll be a lot of these. These will go fairly in depth and into the weeds and into all kinds of directions. But I thought one of the first kind of basic questions we could talk about is basically building your first dungeon, which is something that happens to all of us. Hopefully, this will be useful for folks who are not on their first dungeon, but just maybe looking for inspiration or ideas or whatnot. As usual, I depend on folks here in the chat to help me out with questions and prompts and all kinds of stuff. And in fact, they've already helped me out because this series literally would not exist without feedback from folks. So appreciate that. Hey, Krister, thanks for joining. This is your fault. If this turns out terribly, blame Krister, everybody. And then Ian says, where's Team Ian at? Yeah, we got two Ians now. Only one Ian is currently in attendance, at least as far as I can tell. Hopefully that will change. So I gotta figure out my Windows situation here. Not the operating system, just the actual Windows I'm intending to use. Because I was kind of everything just happening too quickly. So I guess the first thing is just to lay some ground rules. I think at some point as part of this series, I will do a 5-room dungeon type video. We can talk about 5-room dungeons and kind of when it might be useful, when it not be useful, and also just how to integrate some of the things, some of the interesting, I guess, concepts 5-room dungeon versus that you can integrate with sort of conventional dungeon crawling. But at least for this one and probably the first few, we're gonna be sticking to just traditional dungeon crawling. That is, you're going to be traveling through the dungeon spatially and not thematically. At least that's how I kind of look at the 5-room dungeon thing, is sort of thematically going through dungeons. We're going to be talking about going through dungeons spatially. And so that's going to be kind of our focus. I think it's too much to kind of mix and match, and I don't want to get into, well, this one versus that one. So just everything you hear from now forward, unless I say specifically we're switching to thematic dungeon crawling, we're going to be doing spatial dungeons. I think the next thing we could talk about is why you're doing this. Why might we be building our own dungeon? It's fairly obvious in the, I think, when if you're coming from the homebrew background, that you're going to want to make your own things. And of course, Dungeons and Dragons, dungeons is in the name. It's one of the main things that thematically adventurers get up to. I think it's one of the kind of the draws, right? Light your torches, find some hole that goes in the earth and follow it down. Maybe the first thing we can talk about is when it comes to building your dungeon, I think it's good to have a theme. And I think this is the thematicness of dungeons. And what by me, a theme, I guess, is something that unifies this particular place. In a lot of the particularly more old school dungeons, theme wasn't as big of a deal. That's why we get the terms like Funhouse Dungeon for dungeons that just kind of threw a whole bunch of stuff around and stuff didn't totally make sense. With mega dungeons, also in some of the first dungeons were mega dungeons, there was a kind of a tenuous connection between levels of a dungeon. That concept of it being a singular place was maybe stretched or broken. And this isn't unintentional. The first times we heard the terms dungeon, if we read them in, say, the white box, was this concept of they didn't really specify dungeons so much as this mythic underworld. And part of that mythic underworld was it was its own kind of place that could follow its own rules. In fact, it did follow its own rules in several ways. And things didn't necessarily have to make sense the way you might expect stuff in the wilderness to make sense. And of course, make sense in quotes, right? Make sense as they would in a fantasy setting, not necessarily as real life. Hey, got some folks in the chat, Mr. Flip and the Dave. Welcome. But as we've progressed in our thinking about these games, I think that not that people never put out kind of funhouse dungeons anymore, but I think for the most part, people have gravitated away from having a dungeon that'll be a crypt on one level and then a bowling alley on the next level and then a circus on the next level. You'll still find that in places. I think, was it Anonymous Subsurface Environment? I think has some of that still a little bit. And of course, if you're playing a more gonzo game, then this makes sense to you. My background, if you're the first time you've come in one of these videos, is my OSR. I first of all, I come from an OSR type of background, so that's maybe the first thing to know is my basis is going to be sort of old school D&D OSR type playing. And in that OSR realm, which is now huge, usually basic expert is kind of my default. AD&D if I can't find it. White box I also like to pick from, but if I had to, there was one addition that I think is probably wedged in my brain that is this sort of bedrock, at least the way I first think of things, it's going to be basic expert. And the further you get away from basic expert, the more I have to kind of figure out for that. So if you're playing a very gonzo game, you're probably not, I'm not going to have a lot of wisdom on, as much wisdom running gonzo games as I am running the more kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say gritty, because it's not necessarily gritty, but I don't know, down to Fantastic Earth sites of games. Krister asks, what does gonzo mean? To me, when I think of gonzo, it's going back to the idea of things, the kind of fun house. Things are often exaggerated. There's a mashups of many different styles. You might have stuff that's, I don't know, primitive, prehistoric almost in one area, and then spaceships, and then they're colliding, and then steampunk over here, and just more or less a mashup where you can have very almost extreme sorts of randomness can show up in various ways. Not that necessarily nothing makes sense and everything is completely random, but sometimes in terms of which things are all mashed together, it's almost like you put everything in this big pot and then you're pulling stuff out. At least that's how I think about gonzo. So in a gonzo sort of space, everything can be kind of extreme. You can have extreme changes in technology, extreme changes in flora and fauna, just extreme changes everywhere. Whereas I think of maybe myself in more grounded games, we kind of narrow that out, right? A Middle Earth game is really just encompassing Middle Earth, and Middle Earth itself is fairly narrow in terms of what it involves. If you're playing like a real Middle Earth game, you're not going to have a spaceship suddenly land, and then you're not going to suddenly have dinosaurs coming out from here. You're not going to suddenly fall into Earth and end up on Mars, right? Those are, well, I say, more gonzo elements, and I guess if there's something that unites them, it's just that the fact that the changes can be extreme in small space and time. These things can happen very quickly. So when you see more gonzo games, they really embrace that whole stew of stuff, and then there may be games that are more like mine that don't embrace that stuff so much, or the surrounding context has more weight maybe than that. But I'm sure there's probably a bunch of competing ideas of what it means to be gonzo. And yes, the Dave points out Gonzo was a Muppet character that was utterly ridiculous and really made sense. Yeah, is that actually where the Gonzo term came? I never actually made that connection, but it does make sense. Because yes, if you ever watched the Muppet Show and you saw Gonzo, yes, he did ridiculous things, didn't make a whole lot of sense, but they did it anyway. So that is Gonzo. And then Ian says Gonzo is strange for weirdness' sake. That's another, not a bad way to put it. Brian Smith says finding your own barometer for dungeon zaniness is a useful thing to determine. I don't care if an ogre is in a chamber with no other doors, but I do like gravity to work as we know it, for example. Yes. So that's probably a good swinging point. So we're talking about kind of thematics of a dungeon, something that we didn't used to think about so much. Not that they never did, but not as much. They were more open to having lots of different elements interact to. Now we like to think about it that let's say if we're building a dungeon, and by the way, dungeon here is just a structure that's separate from the outdoors. It's the indoors to the outdoors, if you will, or if you're in the Underdark, a further indoors. It doesn't have to be a dungeon, could be a tower, could be a giant house, could be a airship, could be anything at all, right? But we're going from the wilderness into this interior space, and we're generally measuring that interior space on a more zoomed in level. Your 5 or 10 feet squares, yada yada yada. So a dungeon really has a wide scope. In this sense, it doesn't just mean dungeons. But as Brian Smith said, part of that thematicness of your dungeon is really just, is deciding how zany is this place. Now that will usually, I would say, or often you might say, well, what is your setting? Whatever zaniness scale your setting is on, your dungeon could maybe match that, or maybe you'd aim to match it, but then you might have places that are more zany than others. So you want to figure that out. We also want to tend to think about what the current usage of a dungeon is. So before we're kind of mapping, and I'm doing all this, we're talking about this, I haven't even gotten to showing any maps yet, is because these are things I think you want to think about when you're thinking of dungeon. Okay, why am I making a dungeon? Sometimes we end up just drawing out a dungeon and we don't really know what it's for or what it's used for, and then we start to plug that stuff in afterwards, and that's fine. I think that's another technique, but I think when we can be thoughtful from the start, I think it will help us give us that good footing going forward. Because if we start making drawing decisions and then we realize down the line, oh wait, the purpose for this dungeon is this thing, and now my map doesn't have those things in it, now I have to start moving things around. I have to start erasing. And if you're using something like Photoshop or something that's maybe whatever tool you're using is easy to do that, then that's great, but it might cause problems. So to the extent that we can figure out the kind of things that we want to have included before we start building it, that's would be the best. So generally, when we're thinking of in terms of modern games, when we're trying to build dungeons that have kind of purposes, as opposed to kind of big mega structures that don't have a specific purpose. You think about something like, Castle Greyhawk, those ruins that dungeon doesn't really have one specific purpose. It just kind of is, and it fills, and it's this kind of mythic space. But while we'll still have these, often now we're thinking about, okay, we're building a crypt structure. And so the whole structure of this area, and you can also use this for sections of a mega dungeon, right? I would say start small with your dungeon, but if you're doing a mega dungeon, areas of the mega dungeon can still have this kind of internal coherence. Maybe it's a good word. We're trying to build an internal coherence of what we're going to do. The Dave says that they like to draw their dungeons by hand first on a sheet of grid paper. Yeah, I like that too, and it's probably an age thing. Is if folks like to go in and do things drawing it out first or doing it electronically, whatever you floats your boat. To me, it's always easy just to grab some graph paper and a pencil and just go to town. But we don't always have that stuff handy, and the online tools are so much. And I did reinstall Dungeon Draft so we could get in there also. Copy Pasta says they've never tuned in for the last 20 minutes. Hey, well, congratulations on finishing your exams, Copy Pasta. I'm glad you're here. So we want to think of that theme. What is this place? I mentioned a crypt before. Okay, it's a crypt. So we can start thinking about, well, what kind of rooms do we want to have? What is the scope of this crypt? What do we imagine is in it? What's it constructed of? How is it constructed? Kind of that whole purpose thing, because that might determine a bit about how your dungeon's laid out. I could see a crypt being fairly linear and having particular intersections. At least the way I think of it is, I see having, say, a crypt, I could see having sort of ritual importance to spaces. So I might think about, well, how would this look ritually? Not necessarily how it is now when adventurers are coming in, or how it would seem now, but when you're first building this out, say at the time back in the day, right? Thinking about, well, what was the purpose of this place? So I think of maybe ritual space. So you think of a body being some kind of procession that's moving towards different areas. Maybe these areas represent different ritualistic parts of the burial till you get to a burial area. And then maybe over time, let's say that was an important, the main person for this crypt structure was a patriarch of something, but then more branches are created for family members for, say, a dynasty. So you have, say, the main person, your Ramses the Great, is kind of in the central chamber, and then his kids, maybe he moved his parents, and then you can see how it branches out from there. So I'm starting to think about, okay, this is kind of how it was. These are sort of the rooms laid out. This is what I want. I like to try to think about stuff before I start drawing, just so I have that idea in my brain. So maybe I'll sketch that out, and I will. Oh, and Ian says they love Dungeon Draft. He said Dungeon Draft, combining Wonder Draft and Dungeon Draft. So I like to start thinking about that. Again, these were things that if you look at old school maps weren't as important, and they don't have to be important for you. I tend to like having that idea of the thematic stuff, because then I think that the more that this stuff matches some kind of pattern that fits into the fiction, then players can kind of anticipate that and start making decisions off of it. If it's just kind of a big blob of rooms, then as a player, I can't really make any decisions based on that, because it doesn't match up. I have nothing in my experience where I can imagine in my brain as a player thinking, okay, this is a crypt, so probably this is kind of how it works. Like if I think about it, how I might think of, I don't know, tombs in ancient Egypt, and I have no idea how tombs in ancient Egypt were actually laid out, but I could see this concept of the layout of the tomb matching up with the sort of voyage, the ship of the dead, and the weighing of the scales and all this stuff, so that these different kind of moments. So maybe you have like a highlights of life room, and then you have a, okay, now they're going to meet Osiris room, and okay, here they're judged room, and then here they are on the boat with Ra heading around to the sun. So I can kind of get that laid out, and then I can think about, okay, well then, if he died, it's great, and now his sons have died. Maybe they're not as great kings as he was, and so it makes sense for them to kind of attach themselves to his greatness still, and keep this idea of sort of a family burial. So where could they may have chiseled in their own corridors and their own things, and their things maybe not be as grand, but they're going to be up front. Maybe they'll something like that. They'll scale it out. Maybe they'll change entrances. So they'll say, okay, this was the entrance originally, but now they've blocked that off, and that becomes a feature. And they say, okay, maybe they moved the entrance over here, and now this is happening. And now the grandkids come in and they do something else. So you can see how I've taken this thematic idea and I've started to kind of sketch it out. Obviously, it makes the most sense when this thematic idea talking about has some kind of, if not real world, and some sort of imaginary thing that I can figure out. Some things are going to be more difficult than that, or you just kind of have to just sort of make the rules as you go along. Well, what would we think of castles, let's say, in kind of a human sense, but let's say we've got like really our real sort of tree-loving elves. We're going deep. We're not only going to go with the kind of tree-hugging elf, we're going to take that up, turn that up to 11 in terms of elves and forests and trees. So now we want to think of an elf stronghold. So we're not going to be thinking in terms of stone and that sort of thing, and metal. So what might it look like? Sure, we could just build a castle out of trees, and that would be kind of cool in its own way, but maybe we want to think about it differently. And so as we're building out this first stronghold, we might actually feed back into the world building of, well, how do the elves build their strongholds? And now we've come up with it, and now that becomes a model for every other stronghold for the elves, or at least these particularly strong tree-loving elves have. Right, so it says, a literal small river running through a crypt would be cool, maybe too similar to that scene in the original Willy Wonka. Yeah, the Willy Wonka scene with the boat, though. It would be cool if there was a literal boat there. Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about fantasy, right? So why not? Then you could really expand on it. I think that's a great, thought. My model of this crypt is kind of, in my mind anyway, sort of ancient Egyptian style crypt. Another thing to think about is when you have that is, well, how do we amp it up? Because we're not in just the normal world where they're just drawing on walls. They could do all kinds of stuff. So what kind of crazy stuff might they do? And yeah, maybe at some point there was a real river. Maybe they found some underground river and they tapped into it and made that a part of their design. Absolutely. Maybe they trapped some water elementals to kind of churn water for this purpose. You could have lots of fun stuff like that. The Dave says that they like having a dungeon made by someone for a specific person, then having other people live in it that have added their own flavor to the area. Yep, that was kind of my next point. So once you get that first sketch, the next thing you can think about, and this is all about kind of what you have time to do. I don't say you need to do this for every dungeon. I would say do this for the stuff that you have time for, right? This is all about, I don't want to add more prep. If you're finding like, oh my gosh, he's asking me to go through and create 3 different versions of the dungeon and all this stuff and think about all these things. I need a dungeon, right? If you need a dungeon right now, 1-800 need a dungeon right now, then we can skip forward to the part that the parts you do have time for, if that's keying rooms, if that's for something else. And we'll get to how you can, all the resources. I don't know about in this video, but we'll definitely get to at some point, taking a lot of assets that pre-existing that you can use to ease your load, whether it's dice and logos or just whoever. I mean, and remember, my presumption here is that you're doing this for your own home games and you're not creating commercial products. I mean, I think this stuff we're talking about you could use for commercial products, but obviously at that case, you would need to either find the sort of free community, Creative Commons license stuff, or you're going to have to go and license things. But for your home game, any kind of image search in your browser of choice is going to turn out mountains of dungeons, and just take one, use one, rip out an old one, and bend it to your will. Let's see. The Dave said, okay. He has extending his example about having different kind of generations in a space. Says you have an abandoned dwarven city that now has goblins living in it. So there's dwarven architecture in the background with goblin architecture pasted over the top of it. And then Brian Smith says that they always get tripped up doing that. They end up figuring out the actual initial dungeon and instead focus on the current and happens instead. It's a great second layer of detail, though. Yeah, this is all about your time. I think if you have time, you can figure out, hey, what was it? It was a tomb, and I'm going to stick with my example rather than the Dave since I've been talking about it, but the Dave's example is good. It's a tomb complex. Okay, now, maybe we talk about Generation 2. That's what it was originally. That's what it was built, and we have some kind of rough draft. And by the way, you can use something like mind mapping, any where you don't have to be drawing things out by hand. Just you could write circles and attach them. Maybe I should. Let me see if I can actually get that going, because that might be a good thing to do. Actually, all right. Let's see here. So, pardon my. I should have again in terms of things I should have done before. Do I have a mind mapping one here that I can use? They got all kinds of versions of maps. Story mapping, strategy mapping. Let's try this one. All right. Woo. All right, so this is going to look funky at first because they set up this template for me that I do not want. Just give me a moment. Yeah, look at this. All right. Ooh. So I'm going to delete a bunch of stuff here. We could do this. So actually, this kind of works out because we can sort of... we can kind of... I don't know why I lost the formatting when I did that. How did you, I don't know. Why are you doing this the way you're doing this? All right. Brian Smith says, now we're mapping with gas. Right. So we're looking at this. And again, I apologize for not having a better first thing. But I will, one thing we can do is I will keep using this. And then over time in different videos, we can keep expanding this and filling in it. So, okay, so I'm going to erase objective 1, and this will be sort of entryway. Right? So we got entryway. That's number 1. And then we might have, let's say this is the, I was calling it the sort of, I don't know, life highlights chamber. That has an arrow. I want to switch it to that way. Yeah. Oh, I don't need to. Oh, I see. How about none? Where is none? All right. Let's leave it like that for right now. And then we have, let's see. So we have the death journey. And then we have the burial chamber. And I'm not going to get into quite yet, right, the things we want to do. So right now, I guess I'll say this. Right now, this is extremely linear. It's futzing me out that I can't. Okay, that did it. We're talking extremely linear rooms, right? I don't really need the arrows because we're not. It's not one way. I'm just gonna take these arrows off. That's probably better. Here we have an extremely linear set of rooms, but this just might be. This was the original crypt. Actually, maybe I'll call that original crypt. Very simple. You would come in through the doorway, which give you this entryway. You get some kind of chamber that's got your life's highlights. We could probably split this out. Maybe we could have multiple rooms in here. We're just starting to figure this out. I mean, that's kind of the big thing to me is we're just figuring this out. We're just right. We're sketching this out, and we don't even have drawing. We're not worried about map software. We're just kind of figure out. Okay, this is kind of the original thing. We had an entryway. We had a life highlights chamber. We had a death journey. Now I'm going to change this color. I'm going to change all these colors, and I'm just discovering all this stuff in in Ouija or Weehee as we go. So it's not quite the same blue as this, but I can take this, and now this is, let's see, what are we talking about? Expanded crypts. Now we have these rooms that are expanded rooms. And we could think about what kind of things they might be here, and I can move these around. I can delete these arrows. So I can move this around and say, okay, well, maybe somewhere here, somewhere here, somewhere. Is that? Can I link that in there? I can. Or actually, let me undo that. Undo that. We'll say that they made a new entry, right? Because I mentioned that they made a new entry. So then they're going to take that. We're going to attach that to here. And I could make notes. If I was going into more detail, I could say make notes that, okay, this is entry. Maybe I'll put a note in here. I could probably do something else, but now it's walled off. Now I have this going in here. Maybe here we've got a family gallery. Maybe it's a long room, and maybe that will lead there to honor this, but it'll also lead to oops. Oh, that didn't. Oops. Oh, that didn't work. There we go. And these are. Oh, I see. There we go. Right, so it says maybe they made a new false entry leading to a pit trap or something. Got to protect Grandpa's gold. Yep, exactly. Could be, right? We could change that off. And then we've got, let's see. So we'll have, let's see. I don't know. I'm just going to call it Kid 1, Kid 2, Kid 3. All right, so now we have these, and then maybe we might say, oh, you know what, Kid 1, maybe they made another entry from there into the journey, or maybe there's a particular connection. Maybe Kid 1, being the eldest, had some more of a connection with the parent, so that there's some kind of entryway from the Kid 1 to the burial chamber. So now we have a few different rooms. Yeah, maybe we have a false entry over here. We have the new entry over here. Whoops, the entry leads to the family gallery over here. We didn't include the mom. Maybe the mom is over here. Maybe the mom is somewhere else. Now we might think of, just to keep this simple, now we might think of, well, who's in there now? And let's just say now it's a goblin. It's a goblin lair. Dave says, got to protect the illusion of Grandpa's gold. They went in there when it was still easy and gutted the place to fund their bad investments. Probably. I think that's true of all the Egyptian stuff, right? Most of it disappeared in antiquity, right? Never even made it to modern times, because people tomb robbed it basically as soon as the stuff was buried, more or less. And now we've got, let's make some more of these. Now we might think about a midden pit. And some of the stuff could be, you know, we can make assumptions. I like to think of sometimes as goblins and kobolds as not being so much builders as really great adapters of things, so that they look for things that other folks have done and then adapt them to their needs. Kobolds in particular, in my kind of eyes, or at least how I've used them in the past, which is why I feel like they're always great at the kind of traps and tricksiness stuff, is because they're really masters of manipulating stuff they either don't want to, or they don't have the ability to really do the hardcore building, or they just the manpower and stuff, but they'll take it, and once it's built, figure it out. But we'll just say the goblins, maybe they built in a midden pit off of there, dug it out of the wall. We can then describe how you have this beautiful masonry, and then here you have a rough hole. And then here's the midden pit. Maybe they dug some extra tunnels. I'll just put in a reference to something that maybe isn't a one particular room, but a network of tunnels. But I want to call them out that these tunnels are of the Goblin era, and they're going to do things like connect Kid 2's room. They just dug around. It went to Kid 3's room. Maybe they did something else. So here we have this nice color-coded thing where you got 3 levels, and I could build more, and I could talk about, make comments in here of what all these things are. But I think very quickly, I mean, I'm doing this live with you guys, and we've only spent, I'm looking at it, and the stream as a whole has been 33 minutes. So at this point, say we've been talking 20 minutes about that, and we already have a fairly good little thing of, okay, I got so many rooms. I've got some things here. This isn't rooms particular, but I've got this, and I could keep going. I feel like I could spend maybe 10 more minutes talking about what other things my goblins have done. Maybe they made a different entrance too. Maybe this one, let's say this one was trapped. And then this one was blocked off. I'll just say by goblins. So that there's now a new entranceway. And maybe that entranceway goes directly into the gallery. It doesn't go to the main entrance at all. It bypasses it. It goes in there. This maybe is down like that. So we got a nice little network here of a few things that we can deal with. And I would stress that, especially for your first dungeon, we don't need to go huge. You can get a pretty good idea of dungeon size, level size. You can look at older modules. My understanding, what I know of kind of older modules, a lot of times those dungeon levels were built to kind of be basically about a session's worth of activity. So you could go look at a dungeon, see about that size of a level of a dungeon, I should say, and think, okay, that was about kind of what they thought you could chew up and kind of get through before, and then you'd head back to town at the end of it, and then you would kind of rinse, repeat, except the second time around, you would kind of beeline to the next level, go down and kind of go back and forth like that cadence. That will work. Keep in mind that the size of the parties, the length of the sessions, everything it could be, depending on your gaming group, might be fairly different. So you might see some of these and they look like, wow, that's a lot of rooms, but maybe they're playing for, when I was back in college playing, like we played all of a Saturday. So sure, we could have a ton of rooms in a dungeon because we didn't explore them all and all this stuff, and we might get through all the stuff we needed to in a session, but our session was 8 hours long, or even longer. Whereas now in my game, and we've been on hiatus for a bit because I've had family in town, but if a long session for us, if we can get a long session, we're trying to schedule a long session right now. A long session is 3 or 4 hours. So our hour, can we get in a super long session, is half the time at most of what a normal session for me back in the day was. So everything they can be great guides, but go with your feel. You're gonna know your groups. You're gonna know, hey, are they going to take forever to get through this? Are they going to be looking at every door, at every clue, and spend oodles of time? Are they going to be beelining for where they perceive the exit to the next level, or the exit out, or whatever the MacGuffin they're chasing is? And plan accordingly. I would say for your first dungeon, start with something small that you can manage, that you can get to where you want it, as opposed to going for something huge and then being stuck trying to fill it. Back in the day, we used to take, I forget who mentioned in the chat, the taking graph paper and doing it, but I mean, we would literally, you'd have your graph paper and it would be wall to wall dungeon. It would just be no empty spaces. We used mostly almost all squares or rectangles or some variation thereof, maybe a few other angles, but it would be just filled. And they were these crazy, amazing kind of mazes, but they don't make any sense. We were, certainly we were playing kind of funhouse dungeon style, and it was really just seemed to be a point of pride just to or just to fill up the whole paper. No paper left unmarked. And I would say that you could have some fun with that and try it out. I would think when you're starting out, start with a smaller space. I'm not talking about here about having a crypt complex like a City of the Dead. I'm talking about a specific crypt, or in this case, a specific crypt that turns into a family, a family crypt, which then becomes a lair for a bunch of goblins. And here, just with what we've done in this one, and we've only got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, really 11 rooms. So not a whole lot. This is small, but it's okay to be small, especially when you're kind of getting the hang of it. It's all right. I personally would rather, as a player and I think as a GM, have a small dungeon that is really just well put together, thought out, thoughtful, all that stuff, than some massive dungeon with just a lot of dead space, a lot of repetitions, a lot of things that are going to shout out or call out that the person who made this dungeon just ran out of gas, just in their imagination, in their inspiration. When they got to this area, they were like, okay, well, we just need another one of these. So hey, there's just another one of those. Like I don't need that. Like I would just, my preference is not for that. I'm not saying that repetition has no place, because you can do a lot of great things with repetition and dealing. And I think we'll probably do that in a whole other video where it really, I think some of the art and science of dungeoneering, or at least as far as of making your dungeons, is creating patterns and then breaking the patterns in certain areas, because those are clues to your players. If you see that, oh, they're all in this, let's say in the family gallery, I set up a pattern of 12 alcoves in the room, 6 on one side, 6 on the other. And then maybe the next room, there's 12 alcoves again, 6 on one side, 6 on the other. You get to the third room and there's an odd number of alcoves, and maybe there's something else there. Then that's a clue to the players if they put those dots together. Okay, there were 6 and 6, first room, check. Second room, 6 and 6, check. Third room, 6 and 5, wah. And so you can do that. But I think when it comes out and it's really not that, and it's just that, oh, I just needed to fill space, and I'm just going to put another bedroom, another thing, because I can't think of anything else, or just empty. Then you want, and I'm not even against empty rooms in and amongst themselves, but I think you can clearly see where it just needs to be pretty clear. The person just didn't have anything left to put in there, so they just put nothing. Whereas I think you can have empty rooms. I mean, empty rooms are a thing. Places are emptied out and they're kept empty. But I think in terms of what they mean, this is where you can lean on this theme you're building up, lean on this little abbreviated history we've created, so you can think about, well, maybe the room doesn't have anything in it in terms of loot or things, but doesn't mean we can't describe it in a way that it has character. It's not characterless. Maybe that's the thing, it's not that you want to avoid emptiness so much as lack of character. The Dave says dungeons need pantries. Every dungeon should have a good pantry. Yeah, and you also want to think about that depending on what your thing is used for, right? Here in Midden Pit, I could say something here. We could say that's probably another good one, right? So let's fill out a couple. We could fill in some other things. We're thinking about it, right? We're thinking about goblins. I'm just going to delete this for right now. They would have a kitchen area, at least of some kind. Probably want to connect that to the Midden Pit somewhere. Oops. All right, maybe this leads into the tunnels on another side. And then maybe even further, since the family gallery seems to be the main space that they've been using, maybe we do that. I can keep moving stuff around. So we can keep filling that out. And yeah, we think about it. Well, wait a minute. Where do the goblins eat? Oh, there's a kitchen. So I need a kitchen somewhere. Now, I could also say that one of these rooms has been repurposed as a kitchen. Or I could say they dug out something else. Right? We want to think about the goblins. They're probably not Though they might. So here, and here are the things you want to think about. Okay, so the goblins have built some tunnels into the area where these two kids of the king were buried. Hey, Andy B, thanks so much for the super chat. Hey, appreciate it. You want to consider what they need, what their needs are. So the crypt has no needs, right? They're dead people. They go in the ground, and the only needs you might have, which I kind of brushed on, and maybe I'll put a note here, right? Let's see. So maybe I might have to change that word later, but we'll go with it right now. Like, who built it? What was the purpose? What does it need to fulfill its purpose? And I'll just move this to the side. These are the kind of questions we want to ask probably about every one of these levels. The first two, they basically share it. It was built by these people. They wanted to bury their people. Purpose is the burial, and what does it need to fulfill it? It needs to fulfill the kind of religious stuff. If we're thinking, imagine kind of an ancient Egyptian theme, we want to show these sorts of things, that kind of life, which I didn't even put in there, but it'd probably maybe be off this life. Family gallery, there'd be some maybe highlight chambers, maybe anti-chambers for these that have those kind of life journeys. We figure that out. Andy says Canuck bucks. Andy, I will take Canuck bucks. I appreciate it. Thanks so much. Why they build it, right? So to fill those religious needs. So great. I think we've got that. We've got some version of it, and we could go back and flesh this out if we wanted to fill in some more stuff. For the goblins, who built it? Well, they didn't build it, but they're at this point they're what would be the word? They're redesigning it, or no, they're updating it. What is the purpose? It's their home. What do they need to fulfill its purpose? Well, they need a kitchen. They need somewhere to dump their trash. They need some bedrooms, whatever you want to call that. I don't know, maybe we'd say they need a creche for the youngins. And the creche might connect to the tunnels. Oh, so what I was going to say before is the other thing is, so the way we have this design, this not really kind of by chance, as we're looking at this, is they haven't really touched. So they went in and they did a whole bunch of work in the family gallery. Then they dug some tunnels into these kids' rooms, but they haven't done anything with them. And they certainly haven't done anything in the original crypt area. And I could move these around. I don't mean this to be that only one can build on the other. I'm just making those connections. But we can start to think about that. Well, this was just by chance, just as we're talking. Okay, they didn't do that. Well, why didn't they do it? Well, they probably didn't do it because there's undead are a thing. And maybe there's powerful and whatever. We don't know what spells, enchantments, curses, if we're doing the ancient Egyptian thing. Curses, enchantments, all kinds of stuff is on these burial chambers. They probably had full intention of going in there and making this into their bedrooms, looting it, both, putting their trash there. And then they were repulsed by something. And they chose, hey, you know what? We're not going to go back there anymore. We're going to leave that alone. But of course, adventurers, we may not know that. They may even, if we get down to it, if we jumped ahead to what if your players were wandering around this dungeon, maybe the goblins, if trapped, would try to actually lure the party into some of these other more dangerous areas, because those are the places they don't go. Maybe they have the wall, the doors, their tunnel entrances or exits here sort of bricked up. And then they, at some point, just bust down the bricks and then try to just sacrifice a couple of goblins. But we don't know. But it gives us already, just through doing these steps, when we get to the next part of this, which would be maybe drawing it out and then talking about the kind of stocking that we're going to do, what stuff is going to be in the dungeon. Now, suddenly we've got some concept of at least two factions in here, a goblin faction and an undead faction. So already we've got a little bit just from this, like, okay. And I didn't mean to do that. I would love to have said, haha, this is totally my intention. Look how clever I am. Look how clever I am. But I'm not. It just so happened that I just put connectors to other spots. So we've got a pretty good layout We could draw this up now if we wanted to and make these into physical spaces on the map. We could think about how large you want to make those spaces, all that kind of good stuff. I'm not going to go through that here and draw it out because we just don't have time. I think everybody can make their own version of this if they wanted to. Hey, if you want to draw this out, and I'd love to share it on the forums and whatnot, and put it if you want to kind of draw it. Everyone wants to take a whack at how they would lay this out physically. That would be awesome, but we don't have to do that quite yet. But I think the next step you're going to want to do is stock the dungeon. Now, going back to old dungeons, you had your just generic dungeon stocking wandering monster checks you could use. And if you look in the BX in the Dungeon Master tools section, if you look at Into the Unknown and Search of the Unknown, I think has it as well. They actually give you some pretty good guidance in terms of stocking rooms, and you can use the wandering monster tables, the stuff that's appropriate. The problem with that, or I wouldn't say the problem necessarily, but just something to keep in mind is they are very generic. So when you use those charts, if I were to use those charts to fill in our dungeon here, I could get all kinds of stuff that I might not want, or isn't appropriate, isn't thematic. It's not goblin, it's not undead, and it doesn't really match up with anything that I perceive would be related to those. So while you can use those in a pinch, if your party's just traveling and they end up in a dungeon and you're like, I'm just going to roll something up, sir, roll them, use them, and just run it. And you can, if you can, you're able to kind of make sense of it as you're going along. But if not, then we can kind of think thoughtfully of kind of building a roster of who lives here. So I'll just write this in. And I will definitely organize this a bit better when I have time. All right. What I'm going to call them factions. You could call it groups. Culturally, in some places, some dungeons, depending on their nature, the size, whatnot, you might have multiple things in there. If this was a huge complex of the, say a city of the dead, kind of a necropolis, you might have goblins in one area, orcs in another area, something else in another area, a necromancer in another area, an evil or an evil chaotic cleric in another area. That you might have a bunch. Right, so those would definitely be factions. In this case, I'm just going to use. We have basically two different things going on here. We have the undead, we have the goblins. So those are going to be the main factions. Now that we also might have other creatures, and in other kind of creatures, these could be creatures that are just visiting. So that you often come up with that in your, say, using wandering monster checks, monster tables, you're rolling stuff up, you might get, hey, another party of adventurers. They don't live there, they're just also passing through. Or maybe it's a party of orcs, and they don't live there, they're also just passing through. If that's part of the context of the place, if this, say, the crypt we're working on had been discovered, and kind of people have been in and out of there, maybe the goblins are active, and the goblins have been raiding, and so they're attracted the attention of the village that has hired you to go try to stop them, but maybe they've attracted other negative attention, so it might be appropriate that maybe they went and attacked an orc party or an orc whatever settlement, and so now a party of orcs have come looking for them, or a party of elves or dwarves or gnomes, whatever it is, could have come in. If that's appropriate, great. If it's not, then you probably want to just think about, well, we don't need that on the roster. You want to keep the roster as thematic, that fits everything you want, as possible. The Dave says you might have a gold crown on a pedestal that is heavily bent. Two of the statues are golems that only activate when the crown is moved. They have one purpose: return the crown. Yep, that's cool. That's a cool. I don't know what to call that, a trap or just a feature. Absolutely. So we've got factions. We got what other creatures. A lot of times I like to think about, especially for creatures who maybe you're doing things like keeping midden pits and not really disposing of their trash in certain ways, is what kind of vermin, maybe they even get along with the vermin. So I like to have this, the midden pit would be where my sort of giant centipedes or some other things might be hanging about. Maybe there'd be an ooze that's in there. Maybe even a gelatinous cube has been utilized in some way. If they were clever enough to say trap one and they just toss stuff in the cube and the cube just melts it, maybe that is their midden pit. Maybe their midden pit is this weird circular hole in the ground with just the slightest shimmer on the surface that shows that there's a gelatinous cube there. I think I saw that in, I think a dungeon that we covered had something like that where you could just barely see it and you really couldn't because there was a gelatinous cube in there. Maybe they were utilizing that. Maybe they tricked it into that hole and now it just sits in the hole and they feed it. And that's how they get rid of their trash, right? So you wanna think about that sort of thing. What other creatures live here, and how do these factions and creatures relate? How do they relate to each other? And we just talked about, right? We have the undead. They're the original beings here. They relate. They have no relation. They're not going to leave their chambers, but they're going to stop anybody from trying, or they're going to try to stop anybody from getting into those chambers. So that is the kind of their purpose. The goblins, this is their home. So and we would say that they have if we were going to put some kind of reaction roll or some kind of relationship sort of meter or measure to those two factions, we would say they're hostile. And the only thing that kind of saves the goblins from just being run out is that the undead don't leave their domiciles. They're there. You will find lots of guidance that will talk about your stocking, how many rooms have stuff in it, how many rooms empty, how many rooms have traps. They're good. I think they're good starting off points. But I would always say err on what you think is appropriate and what makes sense for the context, and use those kinds of guidelines as your backstop. If you don't know, you don't have an idea, you can use those as a nice starting out. And I think it tends to be something like 30, 30, 30, 30, or 30, 30, 33, 33, whatever. Basically, of how much have like something in it, how much have like monsters in it, how much have monster, like what was it? It's either like trap, something else, I forget, but there's some way of laying out basically how much of it has kind of monsters in it, how much is empty, and how much has maybe a trap and treasure, or monsters and trap. You can see it in in basic experts, in the basic, I think it's in the basic dungeon masters area. I'm sure there are other ones that give you some kind of ratios to use. And I think those are, like I said, I think they're great when you have no idea. If you're in a pinch, you just need to roll something up, you can roll it up. But I also say use the context. So in this case, we might look at it and say, if I was going by kind of 33%, or 33.33%, I definitely know there's going to be treasure loot in the burial chambers. That's just where they're going to be. Stuff that was in the family gallery, there probably could stuff be in there, but it maybe is gone. The life highlights chamber, probably not in these two entranceways. Maybe we don't know where the goblins would have put it in, but I think that probably just these. Let's see, if I just do 1, 2, 3, 4 out of, we were at 11 or 12. I guess it's about 30%. So maybe you say, oh, that's a good number. But at the same time, if I had reasons to have stuff in other places, my reasons, I would just say, are going to override whatever it is that the book says should be. And I'm sure that if you go back and look at some adventures, there'll be some adventures that follow the book guidelines fairly well. And there'll be other adventures that just go off the reservation in terms of the rules. If it suits your game, go off the reservation. Do what feels right. R says they're back for round 2. Hey R, glad you could make it here. So once you have that roster, you've decided, and I would say eventually you will turn this into this roster will become both your wandering monster list and your sort of, let's just copy this. And your room encounter list. Oops. Still not quite got the hang. All right. So you get this roster. That work? Yes. So you're going to take this roster, and it's going to turn into your wandering monster list, also your room encounter list. Just as kind of my own personal thing is, I think one of the things that, and I know it does make sense, but I like to break this rule a lot, is almost always you will find that encounters take place in rooms, the set encounters, and that dungeons rely on the wandering monster list for stuff that's happening in corridors. Though it could happen in rooms too, but often the stuff that happens in corridors is the wandering monster list. And this makes sense, right? Because usually hallways, people are moving. So you don't necessarily see a bunch of people in a hallway. They're moving from space to space. But I like to break that rule because I really like combat in hallways and other spaces besides rooms. I think it allows the creatures and the party to really have to deal with things differently. It can play to their strengths or weaknesses. If you have, say, two fighters, a thief, and a magic user, let's say, as the main party, and let's just assume no hirelings for right now, an open room is tough. Because if the two fighters go charging in to do something, then any creatures out there can just go around those fighters potentially and hit the back, and it's hard because they can't protect your sides. They can't protect the side. They can only really protect one direction front, because you can squeeze in behind them. Maybe you can even put the two fighters, then put the two magic users behind them, then put the thief behind them. Still, you're kind of horribly exposed. You put that same encounter in a hallway, suddenly the fighters can, if it's a 10-foot wide hallway, you can put both fighters up front. They just totally clog the front, and you can really put shields out and march, and then let your thief and the magic users rain down death from the kind of second and third ranks type thing, right? Of course, if something gets behind them, then suddenly it's a big issue because it's really hard to reconfigure. If you end up caught sandwiched in a corridor, that's also really tough. So I really like to play around with that. But you certainly don't have to, right? It's something I think is fun. But I also understand why it's lots of times it's rooms. And of course your room encounters can spill out into the hallways anyway. So you'll take this roster, you'll figure out the stuff's in the rooms, stuff's in the wandering monster list. So going back to our lair here, we could make some judgments. We're going to say, okay, there's families in here. It's not just the kids are the kind of the main patriarch, so they're the most exalted of the burials in here. But let's say there's a whole family of people in here, and maybe some lesser folks in there, the 3 wives and the cat and the dog and whatever. So we'll say in this area, and they're not going into goblin tunnels, and maybe because the family gallery's door has been broken open, maybe something's wandering. And we'll say that we're going, again, Egyptian themes, so there's mummified cats and dogs and all kinds of stuff. Some of the mummified animals are wandering around. So we would take our roster, the undead faction, and we would fill in some here. Hey, mummy cat, 1d4 mummy cats, or maybe 2d4 mummy cats, 1d4 mummy dogs, that sort of thing. And then in the room encounter list, we would think about, okay, well, what are in these rooms in terms of the undead? And we might say, okay, maybe I wouldn't use a D number. I would say there's 3 undead in this one. There's 4 undead in this room. There's 6 undead in this room. Here are their types. Once I have that, I can figure out the treasures that they might have. And you can go back to the old, you can use those old resources for your guidance on treasures. I usually try to think of treasures in terms of what makes sense. These are burial chambers. They have been disturbed, but not emptied. So the undead is active because they've been disturbed, but they haven't been looted. So if these kids were kind of, let's say these were not the most royal, the biggest chamber is going to be, biggest treasure, I should say, will be in the original crypt burial chamber, which maybe we'll say this hasn't even been touched because they never got through this, the first highest kids room to get to this one. So this one's been the original burial chamber's been absolutely untouched. And we're assuming that through means of whatever that hasn't been looted before. So the best treasure will be here. And then maybe a lesser treasure in these other ones, maybe kid 2 and kid 3, even a bit less, because the goblins managed to grab a few things as they ran out the door, sort of thing. They'll be here. And then the goblins, we can think about what treasures do they have? Where did they stick it? Maybe they hid them in the creche. Maybe some of it's in the midden pit. I'll also like to think about, they probably put a back door somewhere. So where does their back door go? I don't like to, I think that most intelligent creatures are going to put some kind of back door. It always annoys me or bothers me when you see someone's throne room and there's no other exits but the way you came in, which is generally the way invaders are going to come in. And then I either think either one, if there's no back doors, then the leader or the ruler, unless they've decided to fight to the death, will have left that room as soon as the first signs of entry into the main area, main, dungeon or whatever structure have been made. As soon as they hear we have intruders, they're getting out of that room. Or B, there's a back door they can scoot out of later on. Because sitting in a room that's basically your own death trap, waiting for things to come and deal with you, it's, I don't know, it just triggers my, this is getting a little too gamey. And plus, who doesn't like to have the bad guy run away and hide somewhere and try to make it out like various villains have tried to do throughout time? The Dave says, unless the ruler has teleportation, and then no back door might be a plan for trapping the heroes. Yeah, of course. If they have mitigating magic, that always helps. And Copy Pasta says that is classic boss monster behavior. It is indeed. All right, so we are at the bottom of, or top of the hour, I should say. I hope this was useful. I think we got through most of the things, right? Because I think the last step maybe to touch on, and then is just doing however you need to do to put it all together. So the final step is drawing the actual dungeon, which you don't have to do. By the way, I could sit there and I could fill in these. If I was, let's say I was going to use this particular layout, I could write in here what I need to. Three exits. Here's the stuff. Here's the entries and exits and the other things. And I could write in things about these different arrows, connectivity, how big the corridors are, if they are corridors, if they're just doorways. You could do that. But the last thing you're going to want to do is figure out, at least finalize finalize the spatial relationships between the different rooms and their sizes, the stuff that's inside the rooms, where that stuff is inside the rooms, and then to write up your actual descriptions. We've placed the stuff that we want to be in each room. Maybe we're going to say there's always going to be some goblins on guard in the entrance. Every once in a while, we might leave the midden pit as an empty room, or maybe I'll say, no, there's always some giant centipedes in the room. And maybe I can even write a note, okay, there's a 10% chance that some goblin maid is dumping out some more yuck in there. There's probably always some folks in the kitchen, babies in the creche, and so often there might be a goblin nanny in the creche or something like that. And I would probably fill out some more rooms. Then I want to write up the descriptions. Do you want to have box text for yourself? Write that up. If you don't need it, then don't write it. Just write, you want to write bullet points. This is the stuff for you. You're building this dungeon for you to use. So whatever things you need to do to take this layout and everything we've done, all this work that we've put in over the last hour or 40 minutes or so, and turn that into the things that you're going to need at the table, that's what you go through and do. That'll vary for everybody. Some folks will be very little, just a couple of bullet points about the atmospherics. You don't forget the atmospherics too. The taste, whatever smells, things you hear, things you see, obviously, the textures. You can really use all that stuff to build up your descriptions, but do it in a way that makes sense for you. If writing up text that you're going to literally speak out loud works for you, then do that. If you just need some bullet points, do that. And then that's pretty much it. You have the dungeon, and then you just unleash your players upon it. Let's see. Ian says, but Todd, what if your players are resourceful and find the back door first? Then, Ian, guess what? They get to go through the back door. That's, I await my players to do stuff like that, which they have done, actually, found back doors into places. But you know what? Then the boss gets to run out the front door. So it's really hard for adventurers to surround dungeons. Not to say it can't be done, but that's the fun thing. I remember I played around with that once, where the party had basically camped out in front of an entrance to a cave complex, had all kinds of stuff going on. And I remember at one point them kind of seeing kind of smoke or fire or something coming up from multiple exits that they were seeing. I think it was at night or something, or they saw people coming in and out, which let them know that, oh, there's a lot of ways out, meaning that if we camp here, we can't camp here and sort of trap them inside, which was a fun moment for them. Let's see. R says the Lich uses his throne room as a massive fireball trap. He doesn't need to worry, as his phylactery will handle the rest. No, Mr. PC, I expect you to die. Yeah, that'll be a fun, definitely a fun trap, right? Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say, as you're thinking about making your dungeons, think about all these kind of tropes and stereotypes and all this stuff, and think of how you could turn them on their heads a bit. Of course, you want that give folks the context so they can figure it out. I would hope that the party's not wandering into a lich's lair and not have any idea it's a lich or a powerful magic user type. That would just be kind of mean. The Dave says, always think about your dungeon's ecosystem. What do things eat? Why do they live there? Well, right. In our case, I would say the goblins are going out into the world to eat. So at least that main entrance probably have a nice path leading up to it because they've just gone back and forth. But yes, if they're not eating stuff, then what are they doing? The undead don't need to eat, so that's great. But if you have other things that are roosting somewhere deep in the dungeon, you have to think about what are those things eating on? How do they survive? If it's magic, and we're in a fantasy realm, it can be magic, but you're going to want to think about that, and you want to describe what that is, and that becomes part of those room descriptions, part of those notes, part of the fabric of the place. Ian says, rocks and mushrooms. They eat rocks and mushrooms. Could be. Coffee Pasta says, fun thing, there's another monster in the dungeon. The goblins have pest problems too. Yep, there could totally be something besides the undead. Maybe the goblins, they tunneled into something else, and then they walled out that tunnel as best they could. Or they try to curry favor with it by feeding it who knows what, to try to keep it over there. Maybe it guards their back door. Their back door, like in the Caves of Chaos. Maybe they got an owlbear, or I think in Caves of Chaos it was an ogre that the goblins were sort of paying off, and they kind of had on retainer, right? And then they could sort of summon the ogre to help them out. Maybe they've made some other kind of relationship with the beast, or they just try to avoid it. Copy Pasta says, they delve too deep and too greedily. Indeed. Well, I do not want to be too deep or too greedy with everyone's time, so we will end it here. Let me know what you think of this new series. Hopefully you found this video useful for creating your first dungeon or your 801st dungeon. I'm definitely open to ideas for how to proceed with more episodes and stuff like that. Thanks, Krister, for the idea. That was super awesome and timely, and I'm glad it worked out well. Thanks, Andy B, for the super chat. Really appreciate that. Folks, if you give a thumbs up on your way out, that would be awesome. If you found yourself in here and you're not subscribed and you like these sorts of videos, it's kind of what I do. So subscribe, and then you can get more of this stuff. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day, night, when you end up watching or listening to this. Game on, and I will talk to you later, everybody.